The rain had begun falling heavily as the night settled over Victorian London. The streets, slick with water, reflected the dim glow of gas lamps. Above, the sky was a thick blanket of clouds, pressing down on the city like a heavy hand. Inside the gallery house, a large, imposing mansion on the edge of the city, the children gathered around the fireplace. The flames flickered, casting long shadows across the room. But despite the warmth of the fire, there was a chill in the air, a dampness that seemed to creep into the bones. The children, eyes wide with anticipation, sat on the plush velvet carpet. They were waiting for the story, the one they always asked for. Tonight, however, the house felt different. A strange stillness had settled over the gallery, a silence that seemed unnatural. The usual hum of the servants' footsteps, the rustle of evening dresses, the chatter of dinner, all were gone. The house seemed abandoned, save for the faint echoes of the children's breathing and the crackling fire. Lady Bertha, the housekeeper, stood at the door, her shadow stretching long across the hallway. Her eyes, tired and drawn, never left the children as she whispered, "Be careful tonight." The words, though spoken softly, carried an unspoken weight, a warning. But the children were too eager to notice. They had heard the stories of the gallery house, the old mansion filled with secrets and whispers. The old paintings that hung on the walls had always fascinated them. Each one seemed alive, watching, waiting. Their gazes followed the children around the room. They could never escape the feeling that the eyes in those paintings followed them. Tonight, though, something was different. One of the paintings, a large portrait of a man in a dark suit, seemed to shimmer just for a moment. A strange ripple passed through the air, like a breath being drawn. The fire crackled louder, a sharp snap cutting through the silence. The children looked toward the portrait. There was again a shift, a flicker. But this time, the man's eyes, they were no longer staring into the distance. They were looking directly at them. A gasp escaped from one of the children. The others turned, their faces pale, eyes wide. The air grew colder, the fire's warmth now feeling distant, as if the flames themselves were reluctant to stay alive. The wind outside howled through the cracks in the window panes, rattling them with an eerie insistence. And then a low, soft whisper. It seemed to come from nowhere, and everywhere at once. "Get out!" The children froze, hearts pounding in their chests. Had they heard that, or had it come from one of the shadows in the room? The fire flickered, casting the room in a deeper, unsettling darkness. The portraits seemed to twist, their figures warping and shifting as though they were alive. Lady Bertha's warning echoed in their minds, growing louder with each passing second. "Be careful tonight." Suddenly, the door slammed shut. The children's eyes darted to it in panic, but the house seemed to close in around them. The walls, the paintings, even the floorboards, all seemed to be watching. And in the far corner of the room, a figure emerged from the darkness. A figure not from the portraits, but from somewhere much older, much darker. A tall man, dressed in a long, tattered coat, his face obscured by shadows. He stood still, his presence suffocating, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The children could not move, could not speak. They were trapped in that moment, surrounded by a darkness that seemed to stretch into eternity. And as the figure stepped forward, the air grew thick with a suffocating pressure. The paintings trembled on the walls, their frames rattling as though they too were alive. And then, with a voice colder than the rain outside, the figure spoke again. "Leave this place, or suffer its curse." The words echoed in their minds, but the children could not look away. They were transfixed by the figure, by the eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. Suddenly, the fire in the hearth flickered and died, plunging the room into total darkness. The children felt the cold air rush around them, and the whispers grew louder, like the scratching of claws on stone. They could no longer hear the rain outside, nor the wind. All that remained was the dark figure, the oppressive silence, and the heavy breath of the house closing in around them. And in that moment, they understood what Lady Bertha had meant. This house was alive, and it had been waiting for them. The air grew thick with dread as the figure slowly moved closer, his steps silent but sure. The children held their breath, unable to tear their eyes away from the glowing orbs of light in the stranger's face. Each second stretched like an eternity, their hearts beating louder than the whispers. The man's silhouette seemed to stretch unnaturally tall as he approached, his coat trailing behind him like smoke. The walls groaned, a low rumble, as if the house itself was protesting this intrusion. The figure came closer still, his form shifting in the darkness, now looming over them. His cold breath brushed against their faces, sending shivers down their spines. "Why are you here?" the figure rasped, his voice like the crack of ice. The children could not answer. They had forgotten how to speak. The room grew even colder, a chill that seemed to gnaw at their very souls. And then, without warning, the figure's hands shot forward, his fingers like long, twisted branches reaching for them. A single touch was all it would take. The youngest child, Clara, gasped and stumbled backward, falling into the shadows of the corner. Her heart raced, and she felt a coldness creep into her chest, a gnawing, suffocating cold. The others froze, eyes wide, too frightened to move. "Do you hear it?" the figure whispered, his face inches from Clara's. She could feel the weight of his words press against her eardrums. Her breath caught in her throat as she struggled to comprehend what he meant. Then, a distant sound broke the silence. A scraping like nails against stone. It was faint at first, almost inaudible. But it grew louder, growing closer, until the scraping sound filled the room, echoing off the walls. Clara's eyes widened with terror as she realized someone was scratching at the walls. Faint, desperate, frantic. But no one else was there. The figure, sensing her fear, leaned in closer. "Do you hear them?" he asked again, his voice now low and guttural, filled with malice. The children nodded, slowly, their faces pale with horror. The scraping continued, relentless, as if the walls themselves were trying to break free from something hidden deep within. Clara couldn't breathe. The cold was suffocating. The figure's eyes glowed brighter, the flickering light from the dead fire casting an eerie glow on his face. Then, without warning, he raised his hand, and the scraping stopped. The children gasped, looking around, wondering if they had imagined it. But the silence that followed was worse than the noise. The oppressive silence. The feeling that the house had drawn all its breath in, waiting. And then, with a cruel smile that sent chills to the depths of their bones, the figure spoke again. "Nothing you hear will save you now." Suddenly, the paintings on the walls shuddered, their frames rattling violently as if they, too, were trying to escape the figure's grasp. The house seemed to lurch, the floorboards groaning, as if it were alive, a creature writhing beneath their feet. The walls closed in, inch by inch, as the air grew thicker, stifling their every breath. Clara looked desperately at her siblings, but they were paralyzed with fear, their eyes glazed over, as though trapped in a nightmare. The figure's shadow stretched across the room, consuming everything in its path. With a single, outstretched hand, he beckoned. And as the air thickened with a dread unlike anything they had ever felt before, Clara could feel something cold and alive, watching them. The house was watching them, and it wanted them. The flicker of the fire sputtered out completely, plunging the room into an impenetrable darkness. Clara could feel the presence, the terrible weight of it, pressing in from all sides. She reached out a trembling hand toward her siblings, but it was too late. The figure had already begun to move again, his hand closing around her wrist with an icy grip. Her scream was swallowed by the darkness. The others didn't even have time to react before they, too, were taken. The gallery house had claimed them, just as it had claimed so many before. The darkness swallowed them whole. Clara's scream was muffled, her voice trapped in the thick, suffocating air. Her wrist burned where the figure's icy fingers held her, a pressure that seemed to reach into her very soul. She could feel the pull, something ancient and malevolent, dragging her deeper into the shadows. The others, too, were lost in the darkness, their forms blurring, fading, as though the very light of their existence was being extinguished. The cold was unbearable now, biting into her skin, seeping into her bones. Clara tried to pull away, but her limbs were heavy, sluggish, as if they were made of stone. The house seemed to groan in response, the walls vibrating with a deep, resonant hum. The very air seemed alive, pulsating with something old and vengeful. And then, in the depths of that impenetrable darkness, Clara heard it. A whisper. Not the figure's voice, this was something else. Something far more ancient. It was a soft, crackling hiss, like the rustling of dry leaves in a forgotten forest. It grew louder, filling her ears, flooding her mind. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, could see nothing, but the whispers filled every corner of her consciousness. "Join us," it hissed, its words curling around her like tendrils. "Become one with us, forever." Her heart thundered in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She was drowning in it, drowning in the weight of the house, in the pull of its cursed history. She tried to scream again, but the sound was lost to the darkness. The figure had disappeared, and yet his presence lingered in the air, suffocating her. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, as though the very foundations of the house were moving. The walls seemed to close in tighter, and Clara could feel the breath of something that wasn't human. Her skin prickled as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. She felt a pull at her chest, as though something was tugging at her very soul, dragging her down into the void. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, the pulling stopped. The darkness remained, but the weight, the suffocating pressure eased. Clara stood frozen, her heart racing in her chest. The whispering ceased, but the silence that followed was no comfort. The air still felt heavy, charged, as though something was waiting. She felt her legs, trembling, as if they might give way beneath her at any moment. Her eyes darted around, searching for any sign of light, any sign of the others. But there was nothing. The room was empty. No paintings, no figure. Just the endless, suffocating darkness. Clara reached out, her fingers brushing the cold, hard surface of the wall beside her. Her breath came in sharp gasps as she tried to make sense of it all. Where had the figure gone? What had happened to her siblings? And why was she still here, alone in this awful, suffocating silence? She stood there, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her chest. And then, just as her fear began to overwhelm her, a single, faint light flickered to life in the distance. It was small, a weak flame, but it was enough to break the darkness. With a shaky breath, Clara began to move toward it, her steps hesitant at first. She didn't know where it was coming from, but she was drawn to it, compelled to move closer. Each step felt heavy, as if the ground itself was reluctant to let her go. But she couldn't stop. She had to reach the light. The whispers began again, quieter this time, like a soft sigh behind her. But Clara didn't dare turn around. She couldn't. The light ahead flickered, casting long, trembling shadows, but it was her only hope. With each step, the darkness seemed to recede, as though the light was pushing it back, pushing her forward. The cold still clung to her skin, but she felt the warmth of the light growing stronger. It was within reach now. And as Clara reached out for it, she realized it was not a flame at all. It was something else entirely. A pale, cold hand reached from the darkness, gripping her wrist with an iron-like hold. And Clara screamed, but her voice was lost once again in the oppressive silence. The hand around Clara's wrist tightened, its grip unyielding, cold, and so strong that it felt as though it was made of stone. She tried to pull away, but it was as if the hand had fused with the darkness itself, anchoring her to the spot. Her heart raced, and she gasped for breath, her body trembling violently under the weight of the unnatural cold. The light ahead, which had seemed like a beacon of hope just moments before, flickered out, vanishing into the suffocating blackness. The hand dragged her closer, pulling her deeper into the void, and she felt herself being pulled into something beyond her understanding, something ancient, something alive. In the stillness, she could hear it again. The whispers. But they were no longer distant. Now, they were right beside her. A chorus of voices, cold and filled with malice, pressing against her mind, suffocating her thoughts. Join us. Become one. Forever. The words twisted and coiled, wrapping around her thoughts like a noose. Her pulse throbbed in her ears as she struggled against the grip, but her strength was nothing compared to whatever was pulling at her. And then, through the blur of panic and dread, Clara realized something. The hand was not just holding her. It was feeding on her. Her very life, her warmth, her soul, everything she was being drained from her with every passing second. Her body grew weaker, her limbs growing heavier with each breath she took, as if the life force inside her was being siphoned away by the unseen thing that gripped her. The whispers grew louder, their voices louder, more demanding. The walls, the paintings, the very house itself seemed to pulse around her, as though the mansion had come alive, hungry for what it had been promised. Clara closed her eyes, trying to block out the sounds, trying to block out the oppressive feeling of the house closing in on her. And then, in the distance, she heard something else. A voice familiar, desperate. Clara. It was her sister, Anne. Her voice was faint, but it cut through the darkness like a thread of light. Clara, we're here. Clara's heart leapt in her chest, hope sparking within her. But the grip on her wrist tightened, and the whispers grew frantic, urging her to forget, to succumb. The walls seemed to close in around her, growing tighter and tighter, the suffocating air pressing against her chest. Clara, come to us, the voice urged again. She fought against the grip, summoning all the strength she had left. Her pulse was pounding in her ears, but the sound of Anne's voice kept her going. The shadows shifted, warping in front of her like something alive. Clara reached out, desperately, stretching her hand toward the voice that called her. And suddenly, there was light. Not the flickering, distant glow she had seen before, but something pure, something warm, something that pushed the shadows back. The grip on her wrist released. The darkness receded. Clara found herself standing, breathing hard, her heart pounding as though she had run a race. And there, before her, stood Anne, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. Behind Anne, there were others. Her siblings. But they were not whole. Their faces were blank, their eyes hollow and dark. The shadows had taken them, twisted them into something unrecognizable. Clara. Anne's voice was a whisper now, strained, desperate. We have to leave. It's too late. Clara could feel the cold again, the creeping, suffocating cold that seemed to fill every corner of the room. The house had never let go. It had only allowed her to escape, for now. But she knew that the gallery house would never release its hold on them, and that whatever force had pulled them in, whatever darkness had claimed them, was still there, waiting. The whispers came again, louder now, filling her ears. Leave or join us. The whispers grew louder, their voices clawing at Clara's mind, demanding, pleading. Leave or join us. The words echoed through her skull, each syllable sharper, more urgent than the last. Clara could feel her heart racing, her legs trembling beneath her as she looked into Anne's wide, fearful eyes. The shadows, dark and cold, stretched like fingers across the room, twisting and contorting as though they were alive, hunting. And reached out, her hand trembling, and Clara grabbed it, pulling her closer, desperate for some kind of warmth, some kind of comfort. But Anne's hand felt cold, colder than it should have been. Clara's breath caught in her throat, and her gaze darted to the others, her siblings, standing motionless, their faces blank and empty, their eyes black as coal. They weren't alive, not in the way they should be. They were something else. "Clara, we have to go," Anne whispered, her voice thin, weak. But Clara didn't know where to go. The house, the very air, had turned against them. The darkness pressed in from all sides, suffocating, crushing. And in the distance, Clara could hear it again. The sound of something scraping. Slow, deliberate, like nails dragging along wood. It was coming closer. The house was awake. "We can't outrun it," Anne said, her voice strained, as if the words themselves were painful to say. "We have no choice," Clara whispered back, her voice trembling. But where could they go? The house had already claimed so much. It had claimed their souls, their spirits, their very essence. Would they even be able to leave? Behind them, the sound of footsteps. Not footsteps of the living, but of something ancient, something that had walked the earth for centuries, waiting for this moment. Clara's breath caught in her throat as the figure emerged from the shadows once again. It was not the same man as before, but something far worse, something more twisted. This figure was taller, its features obscured by the cloak of darkness that hung around it. Its eyes glowed faintly, but instead of the sharp, cold light they had seen before, these eyes were deeper, deeper than the abyss itself. And as the figure moved forward, the shadows seemed to part, as though they were obeying its command. Clara's chest tightened. She could feel the house pressing in on them. The walls seemed to close in, and the darkness became suffocating. We have to run." Anne's voice was barely a whisper now. But Clara couldn't move. She could feel her legs growing heavy, her limbs no longer responding to her commands. And in the dim, cold light, the figure raised its hand. The very air seemed to freeze. The figure's hand pointed toward Clara, and with that simple gesture, everything around her began to crack and distort. The paintings, the walls, even the floorboards, everything began to twist, bending unnaturally, stretching and warping as if the house itself was unraveling. The whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of voices, overlapping and mingling in a horrific symphony. And then, from the deep recesses of the house, from the very bones of the mansion, came a sound like the tearing of fabric, the rending of the earth itself. Clara tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat, trapped by the force of the figure's gaze. And then, as the house seemed to collapse inward, the figure spoke in a voice that was not its own. "You belong to me now." The darkness surged forward. The walls, the paintings, the very air seemed to devour them, to pull them deeper into the heart of the house. And Clara could feel it, too, feel the pull, the tugging at her very soul, dragging her into the depths of the mansion. The cold, the dark, the endless whispers. It all surrounded her. But as the figure's grasp tightened around her, she realized, with a sickening clarity, that there was no escape. No one would leave the gallery house. Not alive. Not whole. Not ever again. The final echoes of their screams were swallowed by the darkness, lost in the endless void. And the house, once again, was silent. The silence was deafening, oppressive, as if the house itself had swallowed all life, all sound, all hope. The whispers, the scraping, the frantic echoes of their screams, they had all faded into nothingness. Nothing but the suffocating stillness remained. The gallery house stood alone in the night, its silhouette looming against the pale, distant glow of the London sky. But it was not empty. It never was. The walls shifted, creaked, as though the house itself was breathing, inhaling and exhaling, slowly, deliberately. Somewhere within its bowels, far below where the children had once played, something stirred. A flicker of light, barely perceptible, appeared in one of the upper windows. It was a faint, ghostly glow, like the last dying embers of a fire long since extinguished. And for just a moment, the house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The darkness had claimed its prize. It had swallowed yet another soul, another group of children to wander its halls for eternity, to join the countless others who had become lost within its walls. But even in the deep recesses of the house, in the places where time itself seemed to bend and warp, there was something more. Something darker. The figure, tall and ominous, whose presence had once filled the children with such dread, now stood in the center of the house. The air around it rippled, as if reality itself were bending and warping in its wake. It turned, its cold eyes scanning the empty halls, the painted walls, the forgotten corners of the mansion. A low, guttural hum escaped its lips, as if the house itself was speaking through it. "You will never leave," it whispered, its voice shaking the foundations of the house. The words echoed through the empty rooms, through the winding corridors. The house was alive, and now it was watching. It had always been watching. The figure's shadow stretched far and wide, creeping along the walls, across the floors, as if it were part of the very structure itself. From somewhere far away, there came a sound, a faint scraping noise, growing louder. It was not the sound of a single entity, but the sound of many. The walls groaned, as though something deep within the house was awakening. The gallery house had not been empty, not even for a moment. Inside the rooms, the paintings that had once held only the children's reflections began to stir, their images shifting and moving. Figures danced within the frames, smiling cruelly, reaching out as if they were alive. The air grew colder still, a chill that reached into the bones of anyone foolish enough to linger too long. But it was not only the house that was watching. The spirits of the children, Clara, and the others, now wandered in the shadows, their faces pale, their eyes empty. They were not dead, not in the way that one might imagine death. They were trapped. They could not leave. Not until the house grew bored of them. Not until it claimed more. Each time the house consumed a soul, it grew stronger, hungrier, more alive. And still, In the deepest corners of the mansion, something waited. Something ancient. Something that had seen the house rise and watched it fall, only to rise again. Something that had been there long before the first child had wandered through its doors. It too was hungry. And as the figure disappeared into the dark depths of the house, leaving only its shadow behind, a new presence began to stir. It was the true heart of the gallery house. And soon, it would be ready to claim its next victims. The heart of the gallery house, an ancient force buried deep within its labyrinthine walls, began to stir with an unnatural vitality. It had waited long enough, biding its time, watching as each new soul wandered into its clutches. Now it was ready. The house had been fed, but it needed more. Clara and the others, trapped within its walls, were merely the beginning. The true hunger was yet to be sated. The air grew thick again, heavier this time, the very walls seeming to press closer, as though the house was trying to suffocate whatever remained of their hope. In the darkest corners of the mansion, the faintest flicker of light appeared. It was not the flickering glow of firelight or candles, but something darker, something more malevolent. It was the reflection of something twisted, a glimpse of the house's true nature. And it was coming for them. Clara felt the chill of the air tighten around her chest. Her eyes, wide with terror, darted around the empty, dimly lit hallway where she stood. The shadows, now deeper than ever before, seemed to stretch toward her, seeking to pull her back into the depths of the house. She could feel it, the presence. Not just the house, but something deeper, something more ancient that had been waiting for her and the others. A soft whisper, low and guttural, slithered into her ears. "You're not alone, Clara." The voice was familiar but distant. Her own voice? No, it was not her own. The figure's cold eyes flickered across her mind. The darkness seemed to hum with life, shifting, undulating like a living thing, pushing against her, surrounding her. It was as if the house itself was rejecting her presence, unwilling to allow her to exist outside of its clutches for even a moment longer. Clara reached out, her fingers brushing the cold, damp walls, feeling them pulse as if the house itself was breathing. The floor beneath her feet trembled, and the air thickened, pressing in on her as if trying to crush her. And then the figure reappeared. But this time, it was not just one. It was many. Shadows poured from the walls, from the cracks in the floors, twisting into more figures, more of those haunting, hollow-eyed faces, all staring at her with the same cold, vacant expression. Clara stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest, as she realized the truth. They weren't just reflections in the paintings. They were the souls of the house, trapped and lost, forever bound to the darkness. Clara's breath quickened, her chest tightening as she backed away, feeling the oppressive weight of the house closing in around her. The whispers grew louder, filling her mind, all of them speaking at once, urging her to join them. "Become one with us. Stay forever. You're already ours." But Clara couldn't move. She was paralyzed, her feet rooted to the ground, as the figures stepped forward, closer and closer, their empty eyes never leaving hers. The coldness of the room intensified, seeping into H. Her skin, sinking deeper into her bones. Her very soul felt it, the cold that devoured her from the inside out. She could hear Anne's voice again, distant, frantic. "Clara, we can't stay here." But Clara was no longer sure she could move. The air was too thick, the shadows too close. And then, a new presence arrived. The true heart of the gallery house. Clara couldn't see it, but she could feel it, the raw power, the ancient energy emanating from the deepest parts of the mansion. It wasn't a figure. It was something far worse. Something old. Something that had no form, no shape, only hunger. The temperature dropped even further, the air growing icy, sharp against her skin. And in that cold, deep, suffocating silence, she heard it, the sound of footsteps behind her. Slow, calculated. The walls seemed to breathe once more, each exhale pushing her further into the grasp of the house. She turned slowly, her breath fogging in front of her. But there was no one there. The house was watching, waiting. It had always been watching. And now it was finally ready to claim her. The figure, the one with the cold eyes, emerged from the shadows again, but it was not alone. It was joined by the others, the ones that had once been the children. They were now something else, something twisted. And as they surrounded her, Clara's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest. The house had claimed them all, and it would never let them go. The gallery house had no end. Only hunger. Only shadows. And now, Clara had joined its eternal night. The shadows pressed in tighter, wrapping around Clara like a suffocating embrace. The very walls of the house seemed to bend toward her, closing in with a deliberate, crushing force. The figures surrounding her, the children who had once been so full of life, were now mere husks of what they had been, their eyes hollow and devoid of emotion, their movements slow and jerky, like marionettes controlled by unseen strings. Clara's breath came in short, panicked gasps, but the cold air that filled the house seemed to steal her breath away, leaving her struggling to fill her lungs. "Join us, forever," the whispers continued, their voices overlapping, pulling at her mind. The very sound of them felt like claws dragging along her soul, pulling her deeper into the abyss. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence of the house. No one would hear her. No one could save her now. The figure with the cold eyes, its gaze unblinking, stepped forward, its presence overwhelming. There was no warmth in its stare, no humanity left. It was nothing but a reflection of the darkness that had consumed the house, a manifestation of its hunger. The figure raised a hand toward Clara, its long, bony fingers stretching out like tendrils of shadow. As it reached for her, she felt a sharp, piercing pain in her chest, as if the house itself were digging into her very soul. "You belong to us now," it murmured, its voice like the grinding of ancient stone. "The gallery house is eternal. And you, Clara, are a part of it now. You will never leave." Clara's vision blurred as her knees buckled beneath her. The overwhelming cold, the darkness, the weight of the house pressing against her. She could feel herself slipping away. But then, in the distance, a faint flicker of light caught her eye. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew brighter, more intense. For a moment, Clara dared to hope. Could it be real? Could it be a way out? But as the light grew, it began to warp and twist, shifting into something far more sinister. It wasn't a light at all. It was another figure, another presence, one even more ancient and terrifying than the rest. This new figure stepped forward from the shadows, its form tall and unnaturally thin. Its face was obscured by a veil of darkness, its features hidden from view. Yet Clara could feel its eyes on her, as if it were staring deep into the core of her being, reading her every thought. It spoke, its voice an ancient whisper that seemed to echo across time and space. This house is mine. These souls are mine. You are mine. Clara's pulse quickened, and she tried to back away, but the shadows tightened around her, blocking every escape. Her legs trembled, but her body felt as though it were made of stone, heavy and unyielding. The figure extended its hand, and Clara felt the air grow colder still, as though her very breath were being stolen from her. The darkness pressed harder, dragging her deeper into its grasp. But even as the house seemed to swallow her whole, Clara could feel something, a flicker of defiance, a spark of her own will surging within her. No, she whispered, her voice barely audible, trembling with fear but laced with a flicker of resistance. I won't. The figure did not react, but the air around her grew heavier, more suffocating. The whispers became deafening, the shadows pressing against her like a living entity, trying to drown her. Yet, in the midst of the chaos, Clara could feel it, the thrum of something deep within the house, something dark and ancient, but also faintly fragile. It was a weakness, a crack in the house's impenetrable walls. And in that moment, Clara understood. The gallery house, for all its power, was not invincible. There was something that could be done, something that could be fought against. She didn't know how. She didn't know where the strength came from. But she felt it deep inside her. A surge of energy, a burning force, filled her chest. With a burst of desperate strength, Clara reached out, her hand shaking, toward the shadows that sought to claim her. She didn't know what would happen, but she had to try. For the first time since entering the house, she fought back. The darkness recoiled, as if stung by her defiance, and for a brief, fleeting moment, the house itself seemed to shudder. Clara took a step back, her breath ragged, her body trembling with the exertion. She could feel the pull of the darkness still lingering, but it was weaker now, more distant. The house had felt her resistance. But had it been enough? The darkness, once overwhelming, now seemed to hesitate, pulling back ever so slightly, like a predator caught off guard by its prey. Clara's heart raced, the pounding in her chest echoing in the stillness of the house. She could feel the cold that had consumed her beginning to retreat, not completely, but enough to give her a sliver of hope. The figure, the one with the cold, empty eyes, stirred, its shadowy form flickering as if disturbed by Clara's act of defiance. But then, as quickly as the shift had come, it was gone. The figure stepped forward again, its cold eyes narrowing with a malevolent intensity. "You think you can resist," it hissed, its voice scraping against Clara's very mind. "You belong to us. All of you. You always have." Clara's legs shook beneath her, but she stood her ground. The darkness still loomed, but she could feel the strength within her, like a flicker of light in a pitch-black room. She wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on, but she refused to let the house win. Her breath was shallow, the chills still biting at her skin, but she could feel something else now, the faintest warmth, like the memory of sunlight breaking through the storm. "I won't be a part of this," she whispered fiercely, more to herself than to the figure, her voice quivering but filled with resolve. Not forever. Not again. And in that moment, she realized the truth. The house wasn't just a building. It was a force, an ancient, consuming power.
But it had not always been this way.
Once, long ago, it had been something else, alive in a different way. And Clara, in her struggle, had discovered that its power wasn't infinite. It thrived on fear, on submission. But when someone stood against it, however small the resistance, it faltered. The shadows around her pulsed with rage, but Clara stood tall. She didn't know what would happen next. The house could still devour her, still drag her into its depths, but she was no longer afraid. She could feel the house waver just a little, and she understood. If she could hold on long enough, if she could continue to defy it, the house would break. The whispers had been relentless, but now they were quieter, less certain. And as the figure stepped closer, its form looming over her like a death sentence, Clara's mind raced, searching for any way out. Suddenly there was a sound, like a crack, a fracture in the air. The figure paused, its attention momentarily diverted. Clara's gaze darted to the source of the noise, her heart leaping in her chest. From somewhere deep within the house, from the very heart of the darkness itself, came a faint, almost imperceptible pulse of light. It was a flicker, just a moment of brightness, like the dying embers of a fire long forgotten. But it was there. Clara didn't hesitate. She turned toward the light, her legs pushing her forward despite the exhaustion and the overwhelming weight of the house pressing against her. The shadows reached for her, but they were slower now, more hesitant, as if they, too, feared what was coming. The pulse of light grew stronger with each step Clara took. It beckoned her, pulling her away from the suffocating darkness that had once seemed inescapable. Behind her, the figure screeched in frustration, its form writhing and shifting, but Clara didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. The light was ahead, her only chance. And as she reached it, something extraordinary happened. The very air around her seemed to ripple, as if reality itself was bending. The house shuddered once more, and this time, it was not a tremor of anger or hunger. It was something else, something deeper, more profound. Clara felt it in her chest, a sudden warmth, a surge of energy that filled her from head to toe. It was as if the house itself had taken a deep breath, and for the first time in centuries, it had exhaled. The darkness receded, drawing back, almost afraid of the light that now enveloped Clara. She wasn't sure what had changed, but she knew one thing. She had found a crack in the house's grip. A small, fragile opening that, if she could push through, could be the key to escaping. With every step she took toward the light, the shadows weakened, their whispers growing faint, almost pleading. No, you can't leave. But Clara kept moving, her body trembling, but resolute. She had to make it to the light, to the source of this force that had begun to unravel the house's hold over her. And then, just as she reached the light, the world around her shattered. The air grew brighter, the shadows collapsing into themselves, and for a moment, Clara thought she might be swallowed by the brilliance. But instead, she was free. And as the light consumed the darkness, she understood. The gallery house, for all its power, was not invincible. It could be broken. It could be beaten. But not by fear, by resistance, by defiance. Clara had survived, and the house had been left to fade into nothingness, its whispers silenced at last. The brilliance of the light faded slowly, like the final glow of a dying star. Clara stood in the center of it, trembling, her eyes blinking against the sudden clarity. The oppressive weight that had held her captive for so long seemed to evaporate, leaving her breathless, but free. For a moment, she feared she might be dreaming, that this was some final, fragile illusion before the house reclaimed her. But the light lingered, warm and steady, and as she inhaled deeply, the air felt fresh, real. She turned, expecting to see the gallery house, the labyrinth of twisting halls and painted rooms, the shadows that had consumed so many. But all that lay behind her was empty space, an endless void of nothingness. No walls, no floor, no ceiling, just the stillness of a world that had ceased to exist. Clara stepped forward, her feet finding solid ground beneath her. There was no more house, no more whispers, no more cold or shadows. She was alone in the vast emptiness. But that wasn't frightening. It was liberating. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Clara felt light, not just in body, but in soul. The house had claimed so many before her, and now it was gone, banished into nothingness by the strength of her will. But as she stood there, heart still racing with the echoes of the darkness, a thought crept into her mind. What about the others? What about Anne? And the other children who had been lost in the house before her? Clara's chest tightened, her pulse quickening again. Had they been freed as well, or had they been consumed by the house forever? Was it truly over for them? Her gaze swept the void, searching for any sign of the children who had been trapped. But there was nothing. The silence was absolute. No faces, no sounds, just the cold, unfeeling emptiness. A flicker of doubt gnawed at her, but then she remembered the light, the warmth that had surged inside her, pushing back the darkness. It hadn't just been her strength, her defiance. It had been something more, something ancient and pure. The very essence of hope, of resistance, had ignited within her and, in doing so, it had unraveled the house's power. Perhaps there was still hope for the others. Her thoughts turned toward the deeper layers of the house, the long-forgotten rooms, the portraits of children trapped forever in frames. Were they lost, or had they too found a way to break free? Clara took a deep breath, steadying herself. The path before her was uncertain, a journey into the unknown. But she had a choice now. She wasn't bound by the house anymore. She wasn't a prisoner of its hunger. With renewed resolve, she stepped forward, deeper into the vast void that stretched before her, her heart steady, her breath even. For as long as she had breath in her lungs, she would not stop searching. Not for herself, but for the others. And somewhere in that endless emptiness, something responded, a faint shimmer, as if the very fabric of reality was listening to her, waiting for her next move. The house was gone, but the story was not over. And perhaps, just perhaps, the children who had been lost would find their way home, in time. Clara continued to walk, the silence of the void surrounding her like a thick blanket. There was no sound, no movement, only the quiet hum of her own heartbeat, the only proof that she was still alive. The warmth of the light lingered around her, though it had begun to dim, its strength fading into the distance, leaving her in a soft twilight. Her thoughts were consumed by one single question: were the others still there? She didn't know how long she had walked, or how far the endless emptiness stretched. Time seemed irrelevant now, just a shadow of what it had once been. It was as though the house had existed outside of time, and now that it was gone, there was no measure by which to understand what followed. But as Clara moved deeper into the space, something began to shift in the air. A subtle change, like a ripple in the fabric of the void. It was so faint at first, she almost didn't notice it. But it grew stronger, more pronounced, until Clara could feel a pull in her chest, a magnetic force, gentle but insistent. Something was calling her. She stopped, her body tense with anticipation. The light flickered again, this time much brighter than before, and through the dimness, Clara saw it, a figure emerging from the shadows, its form hazy and indistinct. Her heart lurched. Was it another figure from the house? Was it the darkness returning, its last desperate attempt to drag her back into the depths? But no. As the figure came into clearer view, Clara recognized it. It was Anne. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Her friend, the one who had been lost within the walls of the gallery house, now stood before her. Anne's form was translucent, as though she were only half there, a wisp of the child she had once been. Her eyes were filled with sadness, but there was no malice, no shadow of the house in them now. "Clara," Anne whispered, her voice barely audible, as if the words were not meant for this world. "You did it. You set us free." Clara's legs almost gave out beneath her, her heart pounding as she reached out to her friend. But her hand passed through Anne's ethereal form, the cold, insubstantial presence sending a shiver up her spine. Anne smiled faintly, as if she understood the pain in Clara's eyes. "The house is gone, but it's not just gone for us. It's gone for all of us. The children, we're free." Clara's chest tightened, a mix of relief and sorrow flooding her. She wanted to hold Anne, to pull her back from whatever place this was, this strange, liminal space between life and death, between freedom and the past. But Anne was slipping away, her form already beginning to dissolve into the emptiness. "Wait!" Clara cried, her voice filled with urgency. "Where are you going? Don't leave me." Anne's form shimmered, becoming more insubstantial by the second. She looked back over her shoulder, her smile now more serene than before. "We're all going home, Clara. The house can't hold us anymore. And you must keep going. There are others who need you. Others who need to find their way. Others," Clara echoed, her voice trembling. Anne's eyes softened, the hint of a knowing look in her gaze. "Yes, Clara. You've set us free, but you have to keep going. You're not done yet. Not until you help them too." The last of Anne's form flickered, and in the blink of an eye, she was gone. Clara stood alone again, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had just learned. The house had not just trapped her and Anne. It had taken countless others before them, each one lost, each one waiting for a way to break free. She had thought the house's grip was finally broken, that she could walk away and never look back. But Anne's words echoed in her mind. "You're not done yet. Not until you help them too." A cold shiver ran down her spine as she realized the full weight of Anne's message. There were others still lost, souls trapped within the gallery house, waiting for their chance at freedom. But how could Clara help them? What was she supposed to do? She had never asked for this responsibility. She had never intended to become the savior of all the children who had wandered into the house before her. But she had to. For Anne, for the others. The light flickered again, this time brighter, stronger, as if in response to her resolve. And this time, Clara could see something more, something shifting within the space, a faint outline of a path, twisting and winding into the distance. It was a road, a journey, her journey. The house may have been gone, but the legacy of the gallery house, its hold on those trapped within, wasn't finished. Not yet. Clara stepped forward, her heart steady with purpose. She wasn't alone anymore. And as long as she breathed, she would continue the fight, seeking those lost souls, finding them, and bringing them the freedom they deserved. The gallery house had been a prison, but Clara had discovered its secret. And now she would be its liberator. As she walked down the path, the light in front of her began to pulse with renewed strength, guiding her toward the unknown. The path before Clara stretched onward, winding through the void, its contours barely discernible, like a faint trail that appeared only when she dared to step forward. The light that had once flickered in uncertainty now blazed with a steady intensity, illuminating her every step. It was a guiding presence, but it was also a reminder of the weight of her new responsibility. Anne's words echoed in her mind. "You're not done yet. Not until you help them too." Clara pushed forward, her feet moving mechanically, as if the path was pulling her rather than the other way around. The space around her remained empty, silent, except for the sound of her breath, steady but unsure. She had no idea how far this road would take her or what she would find at its end. But she had to keep going. For Anne, for the others. As she walked, the air began to shift, slightly, imperceptibly, but it was there. A cool breeze stirred, faint whispers almost lost in the sound of her footfalls. At first, Clara thought it was just the remnants of the house's lingering presence, but then she realized these weren't the same whispers. These were different. Soft, fragile, like voices from the past calling out in the distance. She stopped listening. The whispers grew louder, clearer, until they became words, names. Names of children she didn't know. Names of souls lost to the house, each one now yearning for release. Lily, one whispered. James. Thomas. Emily. Clara's heart clenched. The names came at her like a torrent, each one a reminder of the countless lives the gallery house had consumed. And now, it seemed, they were reaching out to her. The light flickered, growing dimmer as though reacting to the weight of these voices. It pulsed in rhythm with the whispers, as though they were linked, one inseparable from the other. Clara knew what she had to do. She had to reach them, to help them find their way out, just as she had. She began walking again, faster this time, each step more determined. The whispers led her, drawing her toward something. She could feel it in her bones, something ancient, something waiting. As she moved, the path began to change. It was no longer a straight, unbroken road. The air grew thicker, the shadows lengthening, wrapping around her like a cloak. The ground beneath her feet shifted, as if the very earth were alive, undulating with a life of its own. Clara's breath quickened, a sense of unease creeping into her chest. She had walked so far, and yet, the farther she went, the more the path seemed to twist, turning back on itself in a dizzying spiral. The light that had been so steady flickered again, dimming with each step. And then she saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the path. At first, it was little more than a silhouette, a dark shape against the dimming light. But as Clara approached, she recognized the figure. It was a child, small, fragile, and lost. His face was pale, his eyes wide with an empty, hopeless gaze. He stood motionless, as though waiting for something or someone. Clara stopped, her heart heavy with the weight of what she saw. This was one of the lost children, one of the countless souls the gallery house had swallowed. But he wasn't yet free. He was still caught in the void between this world and whatever came after. The child didn't speak, but his eyes seemed to plead with her, his silent gaze begging for release. Clara's throat tightened. She could feel his pain, his confusion, his yearning to escape the darkness that had held him captive for so long. She took a step toward him, her voice trembling as she spoke, though she wasn't sure if he could hear her. "You're not alone," she whispered. "I'm here. I'll help you." The child's eyes flickered, as if he had heard her words, but there was no change in his expression. He remained rooted to the spot, as if he couldn't move or didn't know how. The air around him was thick with the remnants of the house's power, still clinging to him like a shroud. Clara knew what she had to do. She had to break the connection, to sever the link between the child and the house. But she had no idea how. The light pulsed again, stronger this time, as if responding to her call. It flickered once, then twice, then burned with an intensity that illuminated the entire path, pushing back the darkness. The child's form trembled, the shadows around him shrinking, and for a moment, Clara thought she saw something, a faint spark of life in his eyes. She reached out, her hand trembling, but determined. "You are free," she said softly, her voice steady. "You're not bound anymore." The child's form seemed to waver, his figure growing fainter, more translucent. The shadows that had clung to him began to dissipate, fading into nothingness as the light enveloped him completely. And then, just as it had happened with Anne, the child was gone, vanished into the light. Clara stood there, her heart pounding, a mixture of relief and sadness swirling within her. She had done it. She had helped him, just as Anne had told her to. But the journey wasn't over. There were more children, more souls lost in the darkness, waiting for release. The path ahead stretched onward, endless and uncertain. But Clara knew what she had to do. She wasn't just walking for herself anymore. She was walking for them. And with that realization, she stepped forward once more, her resolve firm, her heart steady. There was no turning back. The gallery house had been broken. But its story was far from over. The path ahead seemed to stretch on forever, yet Clara no longer felt the same sense of uncertainty that had gripped her at the beginning. Each step she took now was deliberate, purposeful. The whispers of the lost children still lingered in the air, faint but insistent, guiding her, urging her forward. With every child she freed, every soul she helped toward the light, the weight of the house's lingering presence seemed to lessen. It was as if the house itself was weakening, its grip on the children it had once claimed loosening, little by little. The light that had once been a flickering hope was now a steady beacon, growing brighter with each step Clara took. And yet, despite the progress, a gnawing feeling remained deep within her. She had helped one child, but how many more were still trapped? How many had been lost to the house before her, left to wander its halls for eternity? The thought made her heart ache. Clara quickened her pace, determined not to let the void consume her resolve. The light ahead was becoming brighter, and with it, the path seemed to grow more distinct, less frail. The air itself felt warmer, as though the light had started to melt the icy grip of the house's influence on the world around her. The whispers grew louder again, but this time, Clara could make out specific names, names that she had not heard before. Lucy, Edward, William. Each name struck her like a hammer to the chest, each one a reminder of the countless souls still waiting, still trapped. Clara's heart ached for them, for the ones who had been lost before her and the ones who still needed her help. She couldn't rest, not yet. She couldn't let the house win. And then, as though summoned by her thoughts, a new figure appeared on the path ahead of her. A child, standing alone in the light, but unlike the others, this one was not translucent. He was solid, his form fully corporeal, his face pale and drawn with the same expression of confusion that Clara had seen in the others. This child, this boy, was different. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but with something else. Desperation. His gaze locked with Clara's, and for a moment, she felt as though he could see directly into her soul. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible, carried on the breeze. Clara stopped, her heart aching at the pleading tone. There was no mistaking it. This child had not been freed. He had not yet found his way out of the house. He was still trapped in its grip, still lost in the endless void between the living and the dead. She took a cautious step toward him, but the moment her foot touched the ground, the light around her flickered. For the briefest second, the path she had been walking on seemed to distort, as though the very fabric of reality was warping. The shadows seemed to reach for her, tendrils of darkness creeping along the edges of her vision. The child's form flickered as well, his figure wavering like a mirage in the distance. "Clara," the boy's voice came again, this time stronger. "Please." Her heart tightened in her chest. The light that had been steady and warm began to dim. She could feel the pull of the darkness returning, the cold creeping back into the air around her. This child, this boy, was still bound to the house in ways the others were not. There was something about him, something powerful, something that the house had not yet relinquished. The house was fighting, trying to pull him back into its depths, to claim him once more. Clara's mind raced. She had to act quickly, before the house closed its grip completely. Without thinking, she reached out her hand, her palm extended toward the boy. "You're not alone," she said firmly, her voice strong despite the uncertainty in her chest. "I'm here to help you. You can be free." The boy's eyes locked onto hers. A glimmer of hope flickered there, but then the darkness surged forward, as if it were trying to pull him back into its cold embrace. "No," Clara cried out, stepping forward, her hand still reaching for him. "You don't have to go back. The house can't hold you anymore. Not if you resist. Not if you fight." The boy's form wavered again, a chilling tremor running through the air. The path before Clara seemed to crack and twist, the light fading as the house began to fight back. The child's body trembled, his mouth opening in a silent scream. And then, in a sudden rush, the shadows surged toward him. The house was clawing at him, pulling him into the depths once more, but Clara could feel the struggle. The boy was fighting, desperately trying to break free. Her hand reached farther, desperate to pull him toward the light. "You can do it," she urged him, her voice steady now, her confidence growing. "Don't let it take you." The boy's eyes met hers one last time, and in them, Clara saw the same defiance she had seen in herself. The boy was willing to fight. He was ready to be free. The light around them pulsed with a new intensity, and for a moment, the darkness receded. Clara's hand clasped his, and she felt a surge of warmth, a rush of energy that swept through her. It was as though the house itself were crumbling, its grip weakening, unable to withstand the force of their combined will. The shadows around them twisted and shrieked in protest, but they couldn't stop the light from consuming them. And then, in a final burst of brightness, the boy's form faded, his body dissolving into the light. The path cleared, the darkness vanishing completely. Clara stood alone again, but this time there was no more unease. The house's power had been broken, once and for all. The boy was free, and Clara, though exhausted, knew that her journey wasn't over. There would always be others, trapped, waiting to be freed. But for the first time since she had stepped into the house, she felt certain of her purpose. She had broken the house, and she would continue to help those who were lost until every last one of them was free. With that, Clara walked forward once more, the path now clear before her, the light ahead burning brighter than ever. Clara moved forward, her steps more confident than before, each one carrying her deeper into the light. The air around her seemed to hum with the energy of what had just transpired. The darkness had been driven back, and the oppressive weight that had once clung to her was now nothing more than a distant memory, dissipating like mist in the early morning sun. The child was free. She had helped him find his way into the light, and for the first time, Clara truly understood the gravity of what she had done. It wasn't just about breaking free of the house. It was about offering a path to something beyond, something brighter. Every child she had encountered, every soul she had helped release, was now in a better place, no longer trapped in the endless corridors of the gallery house. But that didn't mean it was over. Clara knew that. As long as there were more children lost, she couldn't stop. The gallery house might have been broken, but its remnants, its echoes, lingered. There were still souls waiting for their freedom. The path in front of her began to shift again, the one straight road now splitting into multiple directions. The light pulsed as if guiding her, offering her choices, each one leading into the unknown. She stopped, uncertainty creeping in. Which path should she take? Where would she find the next lost soul, the next child waiting to be freed? Would she ever reach the end of this journey? Or was it a never-ending road, each twist and turn leading to another place in need of rescue? Her heart beat steadily, but the silence around her grew heavier. She could feel the weight of those who had been trapped, of all the ones who had walked this path before her. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. The whispers were still there, faint but insistent. The names of the lost children were carried on the wind, pulling her in every direction. She could hear Anne's voice, faint but clear. "Keep going. You're not done yet." Clara's eyes snapped open. There was no turning back now. She had come too far, fought too hard to stop. The gallery house had been broken, but it had left a legacy, a calling that she could not ignore. The path split once more, and Clara made her choice. The road to her left seemed darker, the air heavier, but the pull was undeniable. She had to follow it, for she knew deep within her that there were still children, still souls trapped in the shadows, waiting for someone to find them, waiting for someone to pull them out. Without a second thought, Clara took the first step onto that path, the light flickering beside her like an old friend. It didn't matter how long the journey would take. She would continue this fight, step by step, until every last soul was free. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, but now they were no longer alone. The voices of the children, of the lost, joined in, faint whispers that grew louder with each passing moment. They were guiding her, showing her the way. She could feel them with her. Every step she took a promise, a commitment to the souls she had freed and the ones still waiting. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Clara knew one thing for certain: she would never stop walking. Clara's footsteps grew more resolute as she moved further down the path, the light beside her flickering with each step. Her heart was no longer burdened with the weight of doubt. The whispers of the lost children had become a constant presence, a chorus of voices that both guided and pushed her forward. Each whisper was a name, a story, a memory of a child once trapped, now free. She could feel their gratitude in the air, an invisible force that wrapped around her, urging her onward. But the road ahead remained uncertain, its end hidden in the thickening mist. The path twisted and turned, narrowing and widening, as though the very ground was alive, reshaping itself to test her resolve. Clara couldn't see what lay beyond the next bend, and yet she knew she had to keep moving. For every soul that was freed, there was another waiting, lost and alone in the darkness. A deep sense of responsibility settled in her chest. She had come so far, not just for herself, but for them. For the children whose names she had never known, whose faces she would never see. She was their savior now, their hope, their guide to a place beyond the gallery house. The light ahead began to pulse brighter, and Clara could feel it. Something was different. The air around her hummed with an energy that she hadn't felt before. She had crossed an invisible threshold, one that would lead her to the final step of her journey. The road ahead was no longer just a path. It was a doorway. A figure appeared ahead of her, standing in the center of the path. This one was familiar. Clara's breath caught as she recognized her. And the child who had first guided Clara through the horrors of the gallery house. Anne's figure was no longer hazy or translucent. She was solid, her face bathed in a soft, radiant light. She smiled at Clara, her expression warm, filled with the peace of knowing her work had been done. "You did it," Anne whispered, her voice full of pride. "You freed us all." Clara stopped in her tracks, emotions flooding her chest. She had done it. The gallery house, with all its horrors, was no more. And now the children, the lost souls, could finally move on. Anne extended her hand. "It's time," she said softly. Clara hesitated only for a moment before she reached out and took Anne's hand. As she did, the world around her began to dissolve. The path, the light, and the mist all faded away. In their place, Clara felt a sense of peace that she had never known. The weight of the gallery house, of the lost children, lifted from her shoulders. Together, hand in hand, Clara and Anne stepped into the light, leaving behind the remnants of a dark and twisted place. And as they did, Clara knew that she had found her place among them, a part of something greater, something eternal. The gallery house was gone, and in its place, there was only light. Clara stood still, her hand held gently by, and the world around them now bathed in a soft, ethereal glow. The weight that had once clung to her chest, an unbearable heaviness, had vanished completely. In its place was a calmness she hadn't felt in years. The journey had been long, twisted with uncertainty and shadows, but it was over. Anne's smile grew, a reflection of the peace now settling in the very air around them. "It's time, Clara," she whispered, her voice no longer a distant echo but something tangible, something full of warmth. "You've done it. You've given us freedom." Clara could hardly believe it. After everything, the darkness, the endless corridors, the whispers of lost souls, she had finally helped them all find their peace. No longer trapped in the gallery house, no longer haunted by its grasp. They were free. And with that freedom, they had found rest, their spirits no longer bound by the walls that had once held them captive. "I didn't know if I could do it," Clara admitted, her voice barely a whisper, as if saying the words aloud would somehow make it real. "I thought I might lose myself in the process." Anne's eyes softened, understanding flickering across her face. "But you didn't," she said quietly. "You held on even when it felt impossible. That's what made all the difference." Clara's gaze lifted, and for the first time, she saw the full extent of the light surrounding them. It wasn't blinding or harsh. Instead, it was gentle and comforting, like the soft embrace of a loved one. The world felt vast now, boundless, yet somehow it all made sense. It was as if the weight of the gallery house's twisted history had unraveled, leaving only pure serenity in its wake. The path ahead was clear, stretching outward into a horizon that seemed endless, yet full of possibility. And though Clara didn't know where it would lead, she knew one thing for certain. Her journey had come full circle. The gallery house was no more, and its darkness had been dispelled. With and by her side, Clara took a step forward into the light, knowing that wherever the road took her next, she had finally found her place. She was no longer just a lost soul wandering through the void. She was part of something greater, an eternal peace shared by those who had once been trapped and those who had set them free. The final echoes of the gallery house faded into nothingness, and in that silence, Clara felt the weight of the world lift completely. The lost children, the forgotten souls, were at rest. And so, too, was Clara. She had found her peace. And as they walked, side by side, the world ahead glowed with promise, an endless journey of light where shadows could never reach.